Imagine a man who turns a tiny house in a struggling industrial town into the birthplace of a global phenomenon. A man whose relentless ambition lifts his children out of poverty and places them under the brightest lights the world has ever seen. Now imagine that behind those lights there is a shadow cast by fear, humiliation, and the scars of childhood that never fully heal. This is the story of Joe Jackson, the father who helped build Michael Jackson, and the man many accuse of breaking him. For decades, Joe Jackson has been described with two words that shouldn't belong together: visionary and violent. On one hand, without Joe, there is no Jackson 5, no Motown miracle from Gary, Indiana, and quite possibly no king of pop as we know him. On the other hand, his own children have spoken publicly about whippings, insults, and a regime of control so strict that childhood barely had room to exist. In this documentary-style story, we're going to step behind the curtain of the carefully constructed Jackson image and ask uncomfortable questions. How does a father become a manager? And when does a manager stop being a father? Did Joe Jackson save his children from a life of hardship, or did he simply replace one kind of suffering with another, more invisible kind? We'll trace Joe's journey from a broken home in the segregated American South to the steel mills of Gary, to the bargaining tables of Motown and beyond. We'll explore the psychological impact of his old-school discipline, the allegations of abuse that haunted him for decades, and the way those early experiences may have shaped Michael's lifelong struggle with identity, self-worth, and trust. You'll hear how Joe's strict rules, constant rehearsals, and punishing work ethic shaped one of the tightest, most explosive acts in music history. But you'll also hear about the cost. The fear in the rehearsal room, the absence of normal teenage years, and the strange emotional distance between father and son that never quite disappeared. This is not a simple story of a villain and a victim. It is a story of a man shaped by racism, poverty, and his own unresolved trauma, who then passed that pain on in the name of discipline and success. It is a story about how far a parent can go in the name of opportunity, and at what point that drive becomes something darker. Stay with us as we uncover the dark side of the man who built Michael Jackson and ask a question that still divides fans, critics, and even the Jackson family itself. Was Joe Jackson the architect of greatness, or the architect of damage that never healed? To understand the dark side of Joe Jackson, we first need to understand where he came from. Joseph Walter Jackson was born in 1928 in Fountain Hill, Arkansas, in a United States still deeply segregated by law and culture. His parents split when he was young, and Joe ended up in a divided family, carrying the emotional weight of instability at an early age. Like many black families in the mid-20th century, the Jacksons lived at the intersection of poverty, discrimination, and limited opportunity. Ardsib Wasta, an exception. It was the rule. As a teenager, Joe moved to Indiana and eventually settled in the steel town of Gary. Gary was a place of smoke, noise, and long shifts, a city where the American dream was something you survived more than something you achieved. Joe worked long hours in a steel mill, doing dangerous, exhausting work for low pay. Every day reminded him how fragile life could be and how narrow the path out really was. Before there were the Jackson 5, there was Joe Jackson, the dreamer. He tried to escape the grind of factory work through music. He played guitar in a local R&B band called the Falcons, chasing the possibility that talent might loosen poverty's grip. That dream never fully took off. The band went nowhere on a national level, but the idea that music could be a ticket out stayed with him. At home, Joe built a large family. With his wife, Catherine, in a small house on Jackson Street, they raised 9 children. Rabbi, Jackie, Tito, Hermina, Latoya, Marlon, Michael, Randy, and Jeanette would arrive last. For Joe, every mouth to feed was another reminder of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. Factory wages, a crowded house, and an uncertain future all combined into a constant pressure cooker. It was in that pressure that Joe's authoritarian style as a father began to harden. He enforced strict rules. No nonsense, no backtalk, no wasted time. Discipline was physical, direct, and often brutal by modern standards. Several of his children would later describe their upbringing as living in fear. Michael, in particular, would recall in interviews the sound of his father's footsteps and the anxiety it triggered. One story often shared is how Joe discovered the boy's musical talent. He allegedly caught Tito playing his guitar without permission. Instead of reacting only with anger, he recognized the spark of ability. Joe began forming a family band, what would become the Jackson 5. From that point on, the Jackson household was transformed into a training ground. Rehearsals weren't optional. Hours and hours were spent perfecting harmonies, dance steps, and stage presence. Mistakes were not gently corrected. They were punished. According to multiple Jackson siblings, Joe used belts, switches, and harsh insults, calling them names, belittling their appearance, and demanding total obedience. He believed fear produced excellence, and respect came through toughness. In Joe's mind, this was preparation, a necessary hardness to survive a world that was already stacked against young black boys from a place like Gary. But for his children, especially the sensitive, introverted Michael, it carved deep emotional scars. He would later speak about how he would sometimes vomit when Joe entered the room, or how he would cry from loneliness despite being surrounded by his own family. Yet the cruel paradox is this: Joe's approach worked in one undeniable way. The Jackson 5 became incredibly good. The boys, led vocally by a young, electrifying Michael, were razor-sharp on stage. Their timing, charisma, and polish were beyond their years. Joe's iron grip had shaped them into a product that the music industry could not ignore. So when we think of Joe Jackson in these early years, we see a complex picture. A man escaping his own broken childhood, terrified of failure, determined that his children would never be trapped by the same steel mill walls that closed him in. But the tools he used were the ones he knew best: fear, domination, and control. The stage was set. A father's desperation had created a family act ready for the world. But the same forces that would push them to global stardom were already planting the seeds of future pain. By the mid-1960s, the Jackson 5 were no longer just a neighborhood novelty. Joe Jackson had turned his sons into a precision machine. They performed in local talent shows, clubs, and anywhere else Joe could get them on a stage. He was their manager, their trainer, and their warden. Joe handled bookings, negotiated fees, and drove the boys from gig to gig after long shifts at the steel mill. He leaned on promoters, pushed club owners, and never took no easy. He knew that to break into the music industry, especially as a black family from Gary, you had to be twice as good and work twice as hard. Under his watch, the boys were exactly that. Their break came when they caught the attention of Motown Records. In 1968, the Jackson 5 were signed to Motown and moved to Los Angeles. This was the beginning of an unprecedented rise. Michael, still a child, became the magnetic center of the group. Songs like I Want You Back, ABC, and I'll Be There turned the Jackson 5 into an instant sensation. From the outside, Joe Jackson appeared to be the successful, tough-love father who had beaten the odds. His boys were stars. They were on television, on tour, and in the bedrooms of millions of fans around the world. The Jackson 5 weren't just a group. They were a brand, and Joe was the architect who had overseen every detail. But behind the glossy Motown image, problems were surfacing. The pressure intensified. The schedules became more brutal. According to several accounts, Joe's management style didn't soften with success. It hardened. Rehearsals remained strict. Mistakes were still punished. The boys were now international celebrities, but to Joe, they were still sons who needed to obey without question. At the same time, Michael was beginning to develop his own perspective. He was no longer just a child. He was a young star, aware of his talent, and starting to feel the weight of his father's control. In later interviews and his own writings, Michael would describe Joe as physically and emotionally abusive beatings with belts, mental humiliation, and a constant sense of never being good enough. On top of the family tensions, Joe's personal life was far from clean. Allegations and later acknowledgments of extramarital affairs painted a picture of a man whose private conduct didn't match the image of the strict, moral patriarch. One of the most controversial revelations was Joe's relationship with another woman and the existence of a second family. something that deeply wounded Catherine and complicated the children's feelings about their father. As the 1970s progressed, the Jacksons' relationship with Motown began to fray. Joe played a key role in negotiations as the group left Motown for Epic Records, eventually rebranding as the Jacksons. He fought to protect the group's financial interests, but his aggressive style often caused friction with industry executives. Some saw him as shrewd, others saw him as difficult and overbearing. Meanwhile, Michael's talents were blossoming in ways that transcended the group. His solo work, especially with producer Quincy Jones, would soon lead to Off the Wall and later Thriller, albums that redefined pop music. But as Michael's star rose independently, his relationship with Joe grew more strained. The line between father and manager, already blurred, began to disappear entirely. By the early 1980s, Michael made a crucial decision. He no longer wanted Joe as his manager. Quietly, but firmly, he removed his father from that role. For Joe, this was a profound loss of power and identity. For Michael, it was an act of survival, a necessary step to claim his own life and career. Yet, even as Michael distanced himself, the psychological impact of Joe's dominance remained. Michael's struggles with self-image, his obsession with perfection, and his complicated feelings about his childhood were all, in part, reflections of the world Joe had built around him. At the height of the Jackson 5's success, Joe Jackson stood as the man who had delivered his children to fame. But the cost of that ascent was becoming more visible, and the public would soon learn details that shattered the myth of the perfect showbiz father. As Michael Jackson became a solo superstar in the 1980s and 1990s, the story of Joe Jackson slowly shifted from proud father to troubling figure in the background. The world watched Michael transform into the king of pop, but behind his success, interviews and testimonies began to reveal a darker past. In several high-profile conversations, including his famous interview with Oprah Winfrey in 1993, Michael spoke openly about the fear he felt toward his father. He described being beaten, called ugly, and pushed beyond what any child should reasonably endure. Michael admitted that when Joe visited, he sometimes felt sick, physically ill from anxiety. It was a stark contrast to the smiling family images once used to sell records. Some of Michael's siblings confirmed similar experiences. They described Joe as a strict disciplinarian whose punishments could easily cross the line into abuse. Others, however, defended him, insisting that his actions reflected the norms of the time and the harsh reality of raising a large black family in a racist society. To them, Joe was firm but necessary, the reason they escaped poverty. This division, even within the family, speaks to the complexity of Joe's legacy. Was he an abuser? A product of his time, a mantra, clumsily and harshly, to protect his children from a cruel world? Or was he all of these things at once? As Michael faced his own public scandals, including allegations of child sexual abuse in 1993, and again in the early 2000s, Joe-esque responses often struck observers as cold or opportunistic. Instead of focusing solely on his son's emotional well-being, Joe would sometimes use interviews to promote projects, make offhanded remarks, or deflect responsibility. Critics saw this as proof that he had always put business before family, image before intimacy. After Michael's death in 2009, Joe Jackson's behavior again drew scrutiny. While the world mourned one of the greatest entertainers in history, Joe gave press conferences, discussed future ventures, and seemed more comfortable in front of cameras than in quiet reflection. Many felt this confirmed what Michael had suggested, that Joe was more manager than father to the very end. Financial battles over Michael's estate and the care of his children further complicated the picture. Joe, who had long benefited from his children's success, found himself largely sidelined in legal arrangements. This was, in a way, the final symbol of his loss of control, the empire he had helped build now moving forward without him. Yet, in the years leading up to Joe's death in 2018, a more nuanced conversation about him began to emerge. Some of his children, including Michael, in earlier moments, had acknowledged that without Joe's toughness, none of them might have escaped Gary. They recognized his business instincts, his refusal to let them be exploited by early promoters, and his unwavering belief that his children were destined for more. Psychologists and commentators also weighed in, pointing out how cycles of trauma often repeat. Joe had grown up in a broken, harsh environment. He faced racism, poverty, and constant insecurity. He then passed on that hardness to his children, believing it to be a form of protection. That doesn't excuse the abuse, but it does help explain its roots. The phrase "the man who built Michael" is both accurate and incomplete. Joe Jackson created the conditions for Michael's talent to explode onto the world stage. He forced the discipline, demanded the rehearsals, negotiated the early deals. But he may also have laid the emotional groundwork for Michael's lifelong battles with trust, with the meaning of love. In the end, Joe's legacy is a mirror held up to a broader reality. The entertainment industry's willingness to profit from gifted children without asking what happens to them in private. It's a story about how far parents, managers, and corporations will go in the pursuit of success, and how easy it is to justify cruelty when the results are platinum records and sold-out tours. Joe Jackson died in 2018, just days after the anniversary of Michael's death. By then, the world had largely made up its mind about him. To some, he was a monster. To others, a flawed man who tried to do right and went too far. To many, he was a tragic figure, someone whose determination changed music forever, but whose methods left a trail of pain that no amount of fame could erase. As we look back, we re-left with a haunting question. Can you separate the greatness of what Joe created from the damage he caused? Or are they forever bound together in the story of Michael Jackson, the boy he helped build, and the man the world wonders if anyone truly understood? Now that you've seen the hidden chapters behind the Jackson family story, it's your turn to step into the conversation. Who is Joe Jackson to you? Do you see him as a ruthless abuser who crossed every line in the name of success? A tough, old-school father whose methods reflected his time and circumstances? Or a deeply damaged man who passed on his pain even as he pushed his children toward greatness? Tell us in the comments. Where do you draw the line between discipline and abuse? If you grew up with strict parents, do you feel it helped you or hurt you? And after hearing these stories, do you think Michael Jackson's life would have been better or worse without Joe's harsh control at the beginning? We want to hear your thoughts, your experiences, and even your disagreements. Was Joe Jackson the dark force behind Michael's suffering, the driving engine behind his success, or something far more complicated? If this documentary-style video made you see the Jackson family in a new light, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We dive deep into the hidden stories, contradictions, and human struggles behind the world's biggest icons. The parts that rarely make headlines, but explain everything. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join our community of viewers who aren't afraid to ask the hard questions. And now, scroll down and let us know. What do you really think about the dark side of the man who built Michael Jackson?